The water barrel smelled like something had died inside it, and the ship was only 19 days out of port. The sailor who pried the lid open already knew what he was going to find. The brine had gone thin. The cask filled in Nassau before they left was now producing a greenish, cloudy liquid that sat at the bottom in a way clean water never did. He replaced the lid, said nothing to the men watching him, and moved to the next barrel in line. That one was barely better, but it would have to do. 3 weeks of open Atlantic water between the crew and the nearest friendly coastline, and the supply was already starting to fail. That was the reality of a pirate voyage in the early 1700s, and it had nothing to do with cannon fire, boarding actions, or the romantic image of a crew of free men living outside the rules of civilization. It had to do with oak staves, brine chemistry, the heat of the tropics, and a clock that was always running against a ship full of armed men who needed to eat and drink to stay alive and functional. The real danger wasn't the Navy frigate on the horizon. It was the hold below the waterline, where time was quietly destroying everything it could reach. Welcome to Dead Man's Shore. I'm Jack, and this channel is about what pirate life actually looked like when you strip away the myth. If you want to stick around for more real history, hit subscribe and drop a comment below telling me whether you think you could have survived 1 month at sea on a genuine pirate ship's rations. The popular image puts a pirate captain at the table with food and drink that looks at home in a tavern. Rum flows freely. The crew is fed and satisfied. That image comes from novels, from paintings, and from a long tradition of romanticizing the pirate world into something that feels like an endless party at sea. The reality was that a ship in the 1700s was a floating container full of preserved food in a constant race against spoilage, contamination, and insect infestation. Everything in that hold was fighting to stay edible, and everything in the environment was fighting back. The pirate ships of the Golden Age, roughly 1690 to 1730, operated across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean. Every one of those environments was brutal on provisions. The Caribbean offered heat that accelerated every form of decay. The Indian Ocean routes meant long passages between reliable stops. Atlantic crossings could take weeks or months depending on winds and weather. And the ships themselves, sloops, brigantines, and captured merchant vessels chosen for speed over capacity, had limited space for the kind of provisions a long voyage demanded. A crew of 60 to 100 men was a lot of mouths to feed on a hull that might be 80 feet long. The quartermaster, elected by the crew to manage the common stores, faced a logistical problem on every voyage that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with arithmetic. How many days of provisions were in the hold? How many barrels were still good? How long would the supplies last at the current consumption rate? And how far away was the next resupply opportunity? These were the questions that determined whether the voyage succeeded or collapsed. And they were being calculated with imprecise tools and the constant background pressure of hungry men. Start with hardtack, because hardtack was the foundation that everything else rested on. Hardtack was a dense, dry biscuit made from flour and water, baked until nearly all moisture was driven out of it. No fat, no leavening, no seasoning worth mentioning. The whole point was that it lasted. A properly made hardtack biscuit could remain technically edible for months, and in some documented cases, considerably longer. The problem at sea in warm climates was that it became a home for insect life. Weevil larvae bored into hardtack and laid their eggs in the interior of the biscuit, where they developed quickly in tropical heat. Sailors across every maritime nation of the period described knocking their biscuit sharply on a hard surface before eating, trying to dislodge the grubs. Some accounts from the period describe men learning to eat in dim light or darkness so they didn't have to see what was moving in their food. This wasn't a pirate-specific experience. It was simply what Biscuit was like at sea, and pirates were living inside the same maritime reality as every other sailor of the era. Salt meat was the second pillar of the shipboard diet and the main source of protein on long passages. Beef and pork were packed tightly into wooden barrels and submerged in brine, a concentrated salt solution that inhibited bacterial growth and extended the life of the meat well past what was possible without it. The preservation chemistry actually worked under the right conditions. A well-made barrel of salt pork stored in a cool environment could remain viable for months. The problem was that almost none of those ideal conditions applied to a pirate ship in the Caribbean summer. The hold was warm, often humid, and subject to temperature swings that came with weather changes. The brine could weaken if it absorbed moisture from the surrounding air or from bilge water that found its way into the hold. And when salt meat started to go, it didn't announce itself clearly. The color shifted. The texture went wrong in ways that were hard to describe, but obvious to anyone with time at sea. In a world with no refrigeration and no replacement waiting in a clean warehouse, men made judgment calls about how far gone was too far gone, and some of those calls were wrong. Here is something most people don't consider when they imagine a pirate ship. The question wasn't always whether the food had turned. The question was often how bad it would have to get before the crew couldn't eat it at all. Men at sea for long periods didn't have the option of throwing away a questionable barrel and ordering a new one. They ate what was available, including food well past what we would consider acceptable, because the alternative was going without. Alongside hardtack and salt meat, most ships carried dried peas and beans, oatmeal or grain, and sometimes dried or salted fish. Dried legumes were actually a relative preservation success story. They kept well in dry storage, provided protein, and could be cooked into thick stews that added bulk to a meal otherwise dominated by hard biscuit and salt-flavored meat. Strip out any one of these components, and the nutritional balance, already poor, became genuinely dangerous. Now layer the water problem on top of all of that, and you start to understand the real pressure a pirate ship was always operating under. Fresh water was stored in oak casks, because oak was the standard cooperage material of the age of sail. It was strong and widely available, and had been proven over centuries of maritime use. But oak breathes, absorbing and releasing moisture. In warm, humid conditions, the inside of a water cask became an environment where algae could establish and bacteria could develop. Water that was clear and drinkable on day 1 could be greenish, slimy, and foul-smelling by day 20, depending on the temperature and what organic material had been introduced during filling. Ships regularly reported this across all nationalities and all types of maritime operation in the period. It was expected, which is why experienced mariners planned around it. The standard practice was to work through the casks in a deliberate order, consuming the barrels most likely to have already turned first, while reserving the newer fill for later in the voyage. Enforcing that logic against the instinct of thirsty men who wanted the best water now was part of the quartermaster's job, and it required both clear communication and real trust from the crew. The water ration on ships of the period was roughly a gallon per man per day as a minimum functional requirement. For a crew of 80 men on a 3-week passage, that was over 1,600 gallons at baseline, and more in tropical heat where men sweated heavily. Pirate ships had limited hold space, and water casks competed directly with food, weapons, powder, and any cargo the ship was carrying. Every barrel of water was a barrel of something else that wasn't being carried, and the calculus of how much to load was one of the most consequential decisions a crew made before departure. This is where alcohol moved from vice to survival strategy, And that distinction matters for understanding how a pirate ship actually worked. Small beer, a low-alcohol brew, was a standard shipboard beverage across European maritime cultures long before the golden age of piracy. Even a small concentration of alcohol inhibited the bacterial growth that made stored water dangerous over time. Small beer lasted longer than plain water under the same conditions, and remained drinkable past the point where the water barrels had already gone bad. Many ships loaded beer as the primary daily drinking supply and treated water as a supplement, particularly in the early part of a voyage. Wine served a similar function on ships operating out of southern European ports or trading in the Mediterranean. Rum entered the picture through the Caribbean sugar economy, where molasses distilled into rum cheaply and abundantly. By the time the golden age of piracy was in full swing, rum was deeply embedded in the Atlantic maritime supply chain, and a pirate ship working the Caribbean could acquire it more reliably and cheaply than almost any other form of preserved liquid supply. But rum on a pirate ship created a management problem that it didn't create on a naval vessel in quite the same way. A Royal Navy captain had legally codified authority over his crew. He could restrict the spirit ration and punish a man for drunkenness on watch with flogging or confinement. The full apparatus of naval law stood behind his orders. A pirate captain's authority was a different thing entirely. It was real, but it was contingent, derived from the crew's consent and from the reputation the captain had demonstrated. The articles attributed to Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most operationally successful pirates of the period, reportedly contained rules about lights and candles being put out at a specific hour, partly as fire safety in a vessel full of gunpowder, and partly as a behavioral boundary that acknowledged what a crew full of armed men with rum access could become if no limits existed. A crew incapacitated by drink couldn't work the sails in a squall, couldn't fight a hostile prize, and couldn't keep a wooden vessel off a reef. Drunkenness wasn't just a discipline problem on a pirate ship. It was a survival problem, and men who wanted to come home alive generally understood that. Now here is the layer of the system that made the whole enterprise operationally viable in a way that naval ships simply didn't operate. A merchant ship was a floating warehouse. It carried the goods of its trade, but it also carried the provisions required to feed its own crew on the voyage. And those provisions were exactly what a pirate crew needed. When a pirate ship stopped a merchant vessel, the calculation of what to take was not purely about commercial cargo. Salt beef, flour, biscuit, dried peas, casks of wine, barrels of water, live animals, and any other edible stores were all legitimate targets. In some documented cases from the period, crews took food and water from captured ships and left the commercial cargo largely untouched, particularly when the immediate need for provisions was more pressing than the long-term profit calculation. This practice shaped where pirates chose to operate. The busiest trade lanes offered not just the richest prizes, but the most frequent opportunities to resupply. A pirate vessel working the waters off West Africa, in the channels between Caribbean islands, or near a major colonial port, could reasonably expect to top up its stores each time it made a stop. This turned the ship's food supply from a fixed, depleting resource into something more dynamic. The hold's provisions were the baseline, and the prizes along the route were the mechanism for extending that baseline, as long as the prizes kept coming. When they didn't come, the problem became very serious very quickly. Would you risk a 3-month voyage knowing the rations were weevil biscuit and salt meat, with the food situation depending entirely on what could be taken from other ships along the way? Drop a comment and tell me honestly. Fishing was a real part of shipboard food practice that rarely gets the attention it deserves in the popular history. Flying fish, which have the useful habit of launching themselves out of tropical water and landing on ship decks, were caught and eaten. Lines were trailed from the stern. In harbor or at anchor, fishing was a regular supplement to stored provisions. Fresh fish eaten immediately provided nutritional relief from the monotony and inadequacy of preserved rations. Some ships carried live sea turtles in the hold, kept alive without feed for considerable periods as a living store of fresh meat that could be slaughtered when needed. Tropical squalls provided another resource that experienced sailors used actively rather than waiting for it passively. Rigging canvas sheets to channel rainwater into barrels during a heavy rain could significantly refill the ship's water stores and extend a voyage that was approaching the critical threshold of available clean water. In the right climate, at the right season, a good squall could be as valuable as a prize. All of these strategies together formed the layered system that was the real infrastructure of a pirate voyage. The system worked when the layers supported each other. It failed when enough of them failed at once. And the failure mode was human suffering in very specific ways. Scurvy was the most systematic nutritional threat facing any crew on a long voyage in this period, and it shaped the rhythm of pirate operations in ways the popular history mostly ignores. Vitamin C deficiency causes scurvy. The human body cannot manufacture its own vitamin C and depends on fresh fruit and vegetables to maintain connective tissues at a cellular level. Cut off from fresh food long enough, and the body shows it in predictable ways. Gums bleed and swell, sometimes severely enough that eating becomes painful. Old healed wounds can reopen. Skin becomes fragile and bruises easily. Joints swell and ache. Exhaustion sets in at a level that makes sustained physical work nearly impossible. And eventually, in untreated cases, scurvy kills. For a pirate crew subsisting on hardtack, salt meat, dried peas, and rum for weeks at sea, scurvy was a countdown that started the moment the ship left port and the last fresh food was consumed. The preservation processes that made stored rations viable also destroyed most of the vitamin C that fresh food contained. Salt, heat, and drying stripped out the nutrient men needed most over time. The very methods that solved the short-term problem created the long-term one. Some maritime communities had partial intuitive knowledge that certain foods helped with the sickness. Citrus fruit was noticed to have a relieving effect in particular. But this knowledge was inconsistent across the maritime world and wasn't connected to any scientific framework that could make it universal policy. Nobody in the 1700s understood vitamin C. They observed correlations without the tools to explain them, which meant the response to scurvy was uneven, often too slow, and frequently wrong. The practical answer for a pirate crew was the same as the answer to every other food problem. Get to fresh provisions as quickly as possible. Port stops with fresh fruit and vegetables could reverse early scurvy in a crew within days or weeks because the body recovers relatively quickly once the supply is restored. A pirate crew making regular port stops or consistently taking prizes carrying fresh food could keep the risk manageable. A crew on a long passage without either option was in a genuinely different situation. Beyond scurvy, contaminated water caused dysentery and other intestinal diseases that spread fast in the confined conditions below decks. Spoiled meat brought its own acute risks. Heat exhaustion threatened men working in full Caribbean sun. When one man went down sick in a space where 60 or 80 men were eating, sleeping, and working within arm's reach of each other, containing the illness with the tools and knowledge available at the time was nearly impossible. Some pirate ships carried a surgeon or surgeon's mate, and several surviving sets of pirate articles specified that crew members with medical skills would receive an enhanced share from the common fund, because their knowledge had concrete value to the survival of the voyage. The compensation structure for skilled labor was a real principle in pirate organization. But a maritime surgeon of the 1700s was working with bloodletting, crude wound dressings, amputation as the primary response to serious infection, and medicines of mixed effectiveness, He could not cure scurvy without the right food. Better than nothing, absolutely, but not a safety net in any modern sense of the phrase. The Royal Navy comparison is worth making carefully here, because it isn't as flattering to the Navy as you might expect. Naval ships of the same period carried the same basic rations as pirate vessels. Hardtack, salt beef, salt pork, dried peas, beer, and spirits were the foundation of the naval diet, the same as the pirate diet. The Navy's victualling system was chronically corrupt and inefficient throughout much of this period. Ships were regularly supplied with short-weight provisions, watered-down barrels, infested biscuit, and meat below the contracted specification. Naval sailors on long voyages dealt with the same scurvy, the same weevils, and the same sour water as anybody else at sea. The difference was structural. A naval ship had defined ports to call at and an institutional infrastructure that kept provisions flowing even when individual batches were bad. A pirate ship had to improvise the entire supply operation from scratch on every voyage. When the improvisation worked, the results could surpass what a naval supply depot was delivering. When it failed, there was no fallback, and the men in the hold paid the price directly. The ration discipline on a pirate ship was enforced through a mechanism that had no naval equivalent, and understanding it explains why armed crews didn't descend into food fights every time the barrels got low. The quartermaster managed the common stores and was responsible for distribution. His authority over provisions was a form of collective oversight that the crew had chosen to trust rather than having it imposed from above. When food was scarce and rationing became necessary, his role required the ability to reduce every man's portion in a way that was seen as fair, and to enforce that reduction against the objections of hungry men who had weapons and a vote. The articles of most crews specified the distribution would be equal and impartial, that no officer would receive preferential treatment, and that the quartermaster's role was protected by the authority the crew had collectively granted him. A quartermaster genuinely trusted by the crew could enforce short rations on a difficult passage because the men understood that the alternative was running out entirely. A quartermaster suspected of favoritism or skimming from the stores was a quartermaster facing a crew vote at best, and something considerably more violent at worst. Short rationing was a calculated decision with real social risk. A naval captain could put his crew on short rations by order and rely on the weight of law to enforce it. A pirate captain and quartermaster could only do so as long as the crew accepted that the decision was necessary and fairly applied. When the combination of short rations, a long passage without prizes, and weeks of physical discomfort hit a certain threshold of collective frustration, crews acted on their rights under the articles. Captains were voted out, quartermasters were replaced. In some documented cases from Admiralty trial records and colonial court proceedings, testimony describes ships where the deterioration of the food and water situation contributed directly to the breakdown of internal order and the violent events that followed. These weren't rare outliers. They were what happened when the system failed. And the system failed often enough that every experienced pirate understood the risk. The most honest version of a pirate voyage includes several of these pressures happening at the same time. The water is getting low, and the remaining barrels smell wrong. The salt meat is down to the bottom of the last barrel. The hardtack has been full of weevils for 2 weeks. Several men are showing gum problems and unusual fatigue that experienced sailors recognize as early scurvy. The prizes haven't come for 10 days, and the nearest friendly port is still 3 weeks away. Somewhere below deck, men are doing the arithmetic between what they were promised in the articles and what they've gotten so far, and the numbers are making them restless. That is the practical reality of a pirate voyage when the system starts to strain, and it looks nothing like the tavern table with the overflowing plates and the cheerful captain. There are accounts from the period of ships that were days from crisis when a prize was finally taken and the provisions were restocked in time. There are accounts of crews that turned back because the food and water situation left no choice. There are accounts drawn from Admiralty records and colonial court testimony of men who arrived in port in poor physical condition after a passage, with sick crew members and exhausted provisions, despite the commercial success of the voyage. The prize was in the hold. The shares were real. And so was the physical cost of having survived the passage long enough to collect them. If you've stayed with this all the way through, this is exactly what Dead Man's Shore is here for. Subscribe if you want more history told this way, without the myth and without the nostalgia for something that was never as clean as the stories made it sound. That sailor standing over the warm, cloudy water barrel in Nassau before departure was making a calculation that every experienced mariner of the period understood. He knew the water would get worse before it got better. He knew the biscuit already had weevils and would have more by landfall. He knew the salt meat was a gamble and a worse one in the Caribbean heat. He knew men would show swollen gums and exhaustion that meant scurvy was coming, and that the only real answer was a prize carrying fresh provisions or a port with fruit and time to recover. He also knew that the articles were the structure keeping the whole thing from collapsing under its own weight. The equal shares, the elected quartermaster, the rules about distribution, the vote that kept the captain honest. None of it was a guarantee. All of it was a framework built to manage the same pressures that had broken other ships and other crews. Every layer of the system depended on the others. The preserved food only worked if the water held out long enough to cook it and wash it down. The water only lasted if the ration discipline held. The ration discipline only held if the crew trusted the distribution. The crew only trusted the distribution if the articles were being followed. The articles only had meaning if the voyage was still progressing and the promise of shares felt real. And the promise of shares only stayed real if the prizes kept coming and the captain kept the ship in viable hunting waters. Pull out one of those supports and the whole structure weakened. So the next time you picture a pirate ship heading out from port on a new voyage, full of men who had signed the articles and were looking for profit on the open sea, don't picture freedom. Picture a logistical calculation being run against a ticking clock, with spoiled barrels, bad water, hungry men, and the always present reality that the sea cared nothing for their plans. That was the real business of piracy, and it tasted nothing like rum.